Nicolas Cage is an actor whose career has just been filled with iconic roles and lines. This man is an enigma. But perhaps his most famous, well-known line, "I'm going to steal the Declaration of Independence." In this episode, we'll talk about National Treasure Book of Secrets, and get a bit into the future of this historical franchise. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 307 of Waiting in the Sky with TJ Starman. This is a fun one. I'm very excited to talk about National Treasure, a movie that I have memories of sitting in the theater as a kid and really enjoying, really having a lot of fun with, and I can still go back to that movie today and just feel pretty much the same way. So National Treasure 2, Book of Secrets, is one that I'm not quite as attached to. I don't have that emotional attachment to from, my time as a child, but I still really enjoy that movie as well. So having the chance to talk about the National Treasure franchise with the Disney Plus series releasing on the same day as this episode, I believe, December 15th on Disney Plus. I think we're getting the first 2 episodes of that series. It's just a great excuse for me to talk about National Treasure, and I didn't really need an excuse to do it, but Disney gave me one, and here we are. So to help me talk about this amazing franchise led by one of Hollywood's just most iconic leading men, Nicolas Cage, is Daryl from the CageRage podcast. Now, this is a podcast that has documented all of the filmography of Nicolas Cage. At this point, is completely caught up on Cage's filmography, and it amounts to 100 episodes, culminating with the most recent film, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, which itself is a sort of a commentary on Nicolas Cage's career. So very, very thematic, a very just great place for that podcast to wind up at episode 100. It was great sitting down and talking with Daryl. He obviously is very knowledgeable about Nicolas Cage, really has an appreciation for the man's career. And I also loved, some of the perspective he was able to offer as someone in the United Kingdom that can give his perspective, at least. I won't say he speaks for everyone, but looking at the National Treasure franchise, which is so rooted in American history. So we got a little bit of that in there as well. But without further ado, let's jump into that conversation about National Treasure, Nicolas Cage, with Daryl of the CageRage podcast. All right. So, Daryl, thank you so much for being here. I am excited to talk again about Nicolas Cage. I actually did have a Nicolas Cage episode in the last season of our podcast, but I'm sure you will agree with me that there can never be too much Nick Cage.
I mean, you're saying this to a man who's currently caught up on Nick Cage, so I may have to technically differ, but the answer is no, there is never enough Nicolas Cage.
Caught Up is 100 episodes covering the full filmography of Nicolas Cage, which I keep thinking of the episode of Community. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, where Abed joins the class that is trying to determine whether or not Nicolas Cage is a good actor and loses his mind. And I'm very concerned for you, is the point I'm making.
I was lost in the Cage sauce a long time ago. Don't fear for me.
Well, it's incredibly impressive, as I've now mentioned to you multiple times, now off air and on air. And I'm always looking for the authority of a subject to join me on the podcast, and someone who's very passionate and knowledgeable. And I think you certainly fit the bill with regard to Nicolas Cage. So I am very happy to have you joining me, and to be digging into 2 of his films that I really enjoy, and to varying levels. But I want to, before we shift gears into that, I want to just ask you, where did this drive and this desire to put out a Nicolas Cage podcast come from?
I feel like many podcasts in the last 2 to 3 years, it was born of boredom in the pandemic, much like a lot of others. I think wasn't working at the time. Obviously, COVID had shut a lot of things down, so spent a lot of time in the house. I had a microphone, and I'm someone who can get like weirdly obsessed with like one thing for about 2 weeks, then move on to the next thing, and this kind of idea stuck with me. I thought, it'll be a bit of fun. I'll probably end up packing this up by about 5 episodes. And to my surprise, I quite enjoyed the challenge of watching Nicolas Cage movies. And I do genuinely think he's a brilliant actor as well. I'm not one of these people who is an ironic Cage fan. And I know who you are out there. I know the ironic Cage fans. I've weeded you out before, and I will continue to do so until my last breath. But I think he's genuinely fascinating, like a passionate, talented actor. He's a man who on my podcast I call the golden hog of Hollywood, because he's the prized beast who keeps on giving to the farmers of the land, us the viewers. And now here we sort of are, coming towards the end of 2022, and it's a very weird thing to say that you've watched every Nicolas Cage movie. One of the few boasts of my early 30s I can make. So here we are, and now we're just waiting for more films, but getting to revisit some films as well, because it's always, I still find it baffling that people will reach out to ask me to talk about Nicolas Cage on their podcasts, as you very kindly have. So, I will now be forever solidified in the audio rivers of history as a Nicolas Cage guy, which I'm very, very happy with, by the way.
Honestly, you deserve some sort of plaque at the very least. And I've got to say, like, it had to have been so much fun to have episode 100 be The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, and just how meta that movie is.
For sure. It was, couldn't have planned it when the podcast started, but to have that be episode 100 and like the current ending point, a very Nicolas Cage movie to sort of finish on until the new batch of Cage movies come out. It's, some things write themselves, honestly, and sometimes the golden hog himself looks down and he casts good fortune on his most worthy. So if you continue on this track of one Cage movie a season, one a year, then in about 100 years you too will be where I am and feel this the bright warming light of true Cage nirvana, as I call it.
There you go. So I have a new goal to strive for. I'll definitely keep that one in the back of my mind. But I want to talk about, obviously, National Treasure. And so the first movie came out 2004. And for anyone who is somehow unfamiliar with this film, Nick Cage stars as Benjamin Gates, a descendant of, and correct me wherever I misstep, because I'm trying to pull this out of nowhere, a descendant of essentially treasure hunters, or I believe they prefer treasure protectors, is the line in the movie, dating back to the founding of the United States, and sort of holding these secrets of a massive treasure that has dated back to far beyond then. Actually, does that all sound accurate?
I'm following you so far. You've caught my attention. I'm here. I'm still with it.
Does that sound like a movie that you would watch?
This is kind of the thing. You sort of ask, like, I guess any Brit, like, just off the bat, do you have an interest in American history? And they'll probably be like, NFL, or just not know what you're talking about. But I think this, for the non-American out there, the non-US citizen, it's still a really engaging film. And you're like, yeah, I want to know all about this mysterious American treasure. So it did something, right? I'll give it that.
Yeah, no, that is definitely an interesting. I have to say, I'm very glad to have your perspective on that, because it is very rooted in like American history, in the same way that listeners of my podcast know that we did a breakdown of the Assassin's Creed franchise. And Assassin's Creed is a video game series that loves history. And Assassin's Creed 3 in particular was about the American Revolution and that sort of thing. And what they always do in those games is they just kind of reference historical figures, and they give them cameos, essentially. And that's what this reminds me of when I go back and revisit National Treasure, is the way they're just like, referencing different historical events and historical figures, and not giving them a literal cameo on screen, but like it's Benjamin Franklin's, magic glasses that are the key to unlocking this treasure, that type of thing.
For sure. I mean, I guess for the game fans, this is kind of like it's like Uncharted, but without the parkour. It is kind of the way I was sort of viewing it through, and I got to rewatch the first one again today, and I think if Nicolas Cage was sort of Assassin's Creeding his way up buildings, or just running down an exploding plane or something, then this would have made at least $2 billion, I think. But you can't, you can't have everything. The budgets have to come in for a reason. But we hold out hope for a National Treasure 3. We'll get the Cage Drake.
It's so funny because Daryl, I have the IMDb page pulled up as we're talking, and it's got like this autoplay of various trailers going on. And right now we see Nicolas Cage is running through the graveyard in DC, and he's just kind of sauntering through at the same time that you're comparing him to Nathan Drake, and I just love that juxtaposition of ideas.
He's the people's Nathan Drake. Not Tom Holland. Not Tom Holland. Nicolas Cage was right there 20 years ago when we needed him most.
Yeah, you know what? Everyone was on that Nathan Fillion train for a while, but I think we really did miss that low-hanging fruit, which was Nicolas Cage as Nathan Drake.
I find that most of Hollywood's problems can be solved by casting Nicolas Cage, but what do I know? I'm just an insane man in a room with a microphone. What do I know?
Well, so I love this movie, and I think it hit me at the right time because I was a kid. I was 10 years old when this came out, and I think that means a Disney movie. So always have children in mind as the audience. But this was like, it at the time, it hit me as like, oh, this isn't, a cartoon Disney movie. This is like this is my version of an adult action film, but again, for a 10-year-old. And I think it was perfect in that regard. And it's actually a movie that I have grown to appreciate more and more as I revisit it. When were you initially exposed to this film, and kind of what was the journey you've been on with it since?
I feel it must have been around the mid 2000s, because I'm sure there was a point, especially with TV as well, for us in the UK, that America would get everything like weeks, months, sometimes even like years before we even touched it. So I'm sure it must have been around that time. But I always remember enjoying National Treasure, and I think most people will probably say that the first one is better than the second one. And I think for the past sort of 20 years as well, whenever I've watched it, and I think I've probably seen it 5 or 6 times now over the years, it's a film that always holds up. I mean, you say like the fashion aside, and the sort of slightly outdated technology. Who uses Yahoo anymore? Aside from that, it's always a lot of fun. Like the movie just moves at like a nice pace, and even though you sort of it's a very defined good guy versus bad guy thing, it's always a lot of fun to watch. It's one of those films that you're happy to sit down and watch for 2 hours. And certainly for me as well, I think by the time this came out, I must have been about 14, 15 when this came out. Over the years, I've sort of found even like friends of mine who would be either Cage ambivalent or maybe not even really a fan of like Nicolas Cage. National Treasure is one of like the few films that I'll say, I don't like Nicolas Cage, but I do like National Treasure. There's just something so appealing about this film. There's so much like enjoying this film. It's just a good old-fashioned like adventure, and I don't think you can go too wrong with that.
I agree. I think this genre is a really fun one. It's basically just a treasure hunt genre as a whole, and it is very, I think it's more of a crowd pleaser than a lot of Nicolas Cage movies. It's very like just sort of universally appealing, like you say, and I think it's just fun because you feel like you're sort of along for the ride in the way that like you're jumping from city to city and these different situations, and that's basically you're just taking Benjamin Gates and you're just plopping him down in different scenarios and just kind of watching it play out. And I love that about this. I think it's a genre that's probably underserved, in all honesty, because I think about, and this is a little bit of a tease for an upcoming episode, but I think about the murder mystery genre and how that's kind of getting a resurgence with the response to Knives Out, and then we now have the Knives Out sequel. I think this is another like sort of niche genre that could really benefit from some new people exploring it, and we'll get into the TV series later on. But I just think that at the time, this was such a fresh take. It was unique. It was fun, but interesting. It was just this perfect blend of a Nicolas Cage / Disney recipe for a great movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like with it being, if you look at sort of the box office as well, I think especially for the first one, if my historic notes are anything to go by, it made like just shy of 350 million at the box office. So this did really well by all accounts, and I believe it beat out the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and The Incredibles as well. Like 11 million its opening weekend. So Cage 1, SpongeBob 0. You stay in the ocean where you belong, you little freak. But it's an enduring movie, like I say. I think it's still a lot of fun. I guess it's got that sort of classic Disney thing about it where you watch it as a child and then you introduce it to their children and they introduce it to their children. And it's one of those enduring movies that will certainly, I feel, will definitely stand the test of time as well. And like we say, you can't really go wrong with like a globe-trotting adventure treasure hunting film. It's just like a good time. There's not too much to dislike. All the characters, as we say, are clearly defined. And just touch one, you said like Ben Gates is one of these characters who you could drop him into pretty much any scenario in the world where it comes to like, oh, there is a treasure map, there is a secret thing, and him and his merry old gang will find it. And obviously we've got the joy of like a character like Riley Poole as well, who is basically the surrogate for the audience, asking, what's going on? Why are you experts? Why do you sound happy all the time? I don't like it. So justice for Riley Poole, especially only getting like one thing right about daylight savings in the film as well.
No, I love that moment, because I always come back to that every time when we just did have daylight savings time and changing the clocks a couple weeks ago, and I always come back to that scene, and I think I walked into work the next day and I was like, do you know who the first person to suggest daylight savings time was? And I always have to drop that every time.
We've all got to have some go-to trivia, and if daylight savings is your trivia, then I absolutely respect it.
Yeah, and if I had just left everyone on a cliffhanger there, it was Benjamin Franklin who suggested daylight savings time, which I'm so sorry, Ben Franklin. We are going to do away with that next year. So that we're going to lose a little bit of relevance, I suppose, in this movie as a result of that. But I do think it'll carry on the legacy of this movie. I love that you talked about it being passed down like generation to generation, which is, it's very on theme for this one.
Yeah, I think the real treasure all along, and I'll save you listeners trying to figure it out. There's no sort of clues or riddles here. The real treasure was Nicolas Cage all along, and he will out. I've said it from day one on my podcast. He will outlive us all.
I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. In all honesty, for Nicolas Cage to just be, he'll be the true torchbearer from society to society until the end of time. And I think we'd be remiss to not touch on the rest of the cast here, some of the standouts. Obviously, so Justin Bartha as Riley Poole, who you mentioned. Diane Kruger plays Abigail Chase, who is a love interest with some depth to her character, which I don't think was always a given at this point in time. But I really appreciated the way that they wrote her character, able to carry her own with Ben, who is supposed to be this, otherworldly historian, and she's right there with him. John Voight plays this part, I think, wonderfully, as this sort of parent that's reluctantly along for the ride and is like half bitter, half concerned for the safety of his son. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, Sean Bean, unfortunately does not make it out of this one. And no one could have suspected that.
Well, Sean Bean, one of the sons of the North, from Sheffield. I'm based in Leeds, so Sheffield's like the rival town, basically. But he's just one of those actors who's just synonymous with like British TV, and obviously synonymous with dying on screen as well. So he gets arrested. Unfortunately, I think this is one of the few films where he doesn't die. I think by this point, with his cinematography, he died over 20 times on screen at this point. So I know this must have been a challenging role to take for him as the role of an alive person.
The role of an alive person, yeah. And I was mixing things up, but we'll get to that in a moment here. But I did actually want to touch about his character, because I think, especially when we compare it to Book of Secrets, his antagonist role is interesting, because it's not like, as someone who was a Bond villain, like, he's very much not a Bond villain in this. He's just like a rival that's after the same prize. He's just much more cutthroat and willing to do anything, versus Ben, Nicolas Cage's character, who is much more, like, the history itself is sacred. And it's not just about finding this treasure. It's about preserving all of this history on your way to finding the treasure. And so I think it's the way that they did that and made it that like they're rival treasure hunters, and not like Ian is just trying to kill Ben because he's an obstacle in his way. Was an interesting take, and it's something that I appreciate now, despite the fact that, like you said, Daryl, it is still very good guy versus bad guy, just not that they're like, waging war against each other type of way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's not like that any of them are necessarily like good guy for the sake of being good guy and bad guy for the sake of being bad guy. Because obviously they're working together with a mutual interest, but it all comes down to that drastic Declaration of Independence, which you Americans love so much. Once upon a time we owned you. So obviously a sore point for any British person watching. But it's like, it just obviously just comes down to, they disagree on how it is that they need to proceed going forward. They both realise that they need to get to the Declaration of Independence, but one's like, oh, we should probably, do it sneaky. And then Sean Bean's like, let's blow up America. So, and who of us mortals hasn't had a disagreement like that with our peers at some point in the past? It's a very understandable sort of origin point. But again, I think it's a thing for like anytime British people sort of see Sean Bean on screen, like I said, either he's some absolute hero of a man, or he's a complete villain and he's going to die. So we see him come on screen and we think, all right, Sean, what are you up to this time? We know what you're all about. I think if you're au fait with his work, that you kind of know he's going to be a villain. But like I say, it's kind of the brains versus not so much brawn, but kind of like resources. It's, Ben and his smarts and his team versus a person with infinite resources who is also smart as well. So it's not that he has like a massive backstory or arc or anything. It's a children's adventure film or a family adventure film. He doesn't need to have an in-depth backstory. What they do with him works. It's just like, okay, well, I've tried to kill you at the start of the film, therefore this is my narrative line now, and I'm going to be the antagonist for this. And also, anyone who's running around wearing a suit with like slick back blonde hair, always going to be bad news. Was always going to be bad news. So.
Yep. Yeah, you're bad news and or a hockey player. So,
exactly.
If you're watching D2 The Mighty Ducks, then probably both.
It's easy to do. It's very easy to do. And hockey is obviously a thing that we definitely have over here. So references everyone. I've heard they play on dirt. Is it dirt hockey? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, dirt hockey, which this is a quick aside. I think this is hilarious because at the time we're recording this, and this is opening day of the World Cup, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
So just the juxtaposition, that's a thing I'm not even sure is going on, but I think is. And to me, recording outside of Chicago. It's just Bears Sunday NFL football. So the juxtaposition of sports here that everyone was not expecting in the Nicolas Cage National Treasure episode.
This is the thing with Nicolas Cage. Expect the unexpected, because anything can and will happen.
And I'm going to take that as a nice little segue, because I think in watching just the trailers that, like I said, are auto playing on IMDb right now, I totally forgot that we also have a very small role. Playing in a very small role is Eric King from Dexter. And if you're not familiar with him, Richard is going to add in his most famous clip right here.
Surprise, motherfucker.
Well, there's a few little famous faces that pop up in this. The surprise motherfucker man. Mark Pellegrino pops up as an FBI agent. There's, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but like right at the start of the movie in the flashback, like the coach boy is like that guy from Hannah Montana, I think.
Is it Jason Earl?
Yes, that's his name. The guy who you thought was supposed to be playing like a 5-year-old but was 40 the whole time.
Yep.
Yeah. Jason Earls is right at the start as the coach boy. And I was like, I know your face. Where do I know your face from?
Yeah, that was very Disney, pulling from their pool of Disney actors.
The Disney pool. You never know when you're going to get called up.
And of course, you also have Christopher Plummer from the opening scene, and Harvey Keitel as the FBI agent. I don't know how to pronounce it. Sadusky?
I think it's Sadusky.
But yeah, no, a lot of recognizable names and or faces in this one. But Daryl, any last thoughts on National Treasure before we jump to the sequel?
I mean, again, it's the National Treasure film. It's weird to think that it's coming up to 20 years since National Treasure released. And again, I think when we talk about it in the context of the Nicolas Cage filmography, is it necessarily going to be anyone's favorite Nicolas Cage film? I don't think so, but I think justifiably many people might find it in their top 10s because it's so easy to watch, it's so relatable. I remember when I looked into this episode, I think there was something on the DVD with the director John Turteltaub saying the original rough cut of National Treasure was supposed to be about 4 hours long. So to this day, I say, release the Turteltaub cut, you cowards. I want another hour and a half of Cage. I think the only other interesting facts I saw was there was a press tour where Cage was saying that he and co-star Diane Kruger, they bonded by going out and singing karaoke, and he's quoted as saying, I think it was Rage Against the Machine, AC/DC, and some Sex Pistols. So honestly, incredible stuff.
Yeah, speaking of trivia, I love that. I didn't know that, and I'm gonna hold on to that bit of trivia for a while now. Yeah, no, I think exactly like you're saying, very, very easy to watch. And I think that was something that carried over into the sequel. I think I missed this one in its initial run, whereas I did see the first movie in the theater. I think Book of Secrets was one that I came back to probably a year or two after its release, where I was just kind of like, now I was probably in junior high school, and I'm like, oh, hey, there's a second National Treasure. I should probably watch this. And I think they did a good job of keeping the same tone, and it just feels like a natural progression of the story. But they kind of looked at the first one, and they were like, hey, this worked. It turned out really well. Let's just do that again. And they kind of did.
Yeah, I mean, it was very much a case of, you've got the formula here. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And in terms of the writers and directors, John Turteltaub returned to direct, and John Turteltaub also helmed another Nicolas Cage film, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. I think he did Cool Runnings as well, more recently with Jason Statham, The Meg. And they're the same people behind the screenplay, Cormac and Marianne Wibberley, the wonderful Wibberleys, as I call them, who are just this married couple who have just been behind a number of just like ridiculous films in the 2000s. National Treasure 1 and 2. There was another Nick Cage film, G-Force, in which he voiced a star-nosed mole. They also wrote Bad Boys 2. They're just this like old white couple who wrote Bad Boys 2, which is ridiculous, but they've just pumped out some like really good movies. And I think they're working on the new National Treasure series as well. So, in theory, on paper, tonally, it should be pretty consistent with the movies as well. If anyone is worried about what shape the TV show is going to look like.
Yeah, no, that's quite the filmography, the body of work there. That's very interesting. So I watched this one last night because I've definitely watched this one a lot less than the first one, but I enjoyed it. I think it. I don't know that I like it as much, but I do like it, and I thought it was a lot of fun, especially because I think at this time the story from the first one has kind of, I've watched it so many times. It's like just second nature to me. I know every plot point. It is nice to kind of mix this one in there on occasion to keep me guessing a little bit more. I don't know all the answers to the clues every time just yet. And so I had a good time with it, rewatching it last night. A lot of the same like story elements are there with the treasure hunting aspect. It seems a little bit more self-contained, like they're not quite globetrotting as much. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about like technically this film is absolutely fine. There's something about it that isn't quite as good as the first one. There was like a certain magic that the first one had that the second one didn't quite have. So I didn't get a chance to sort of watch this one, but I remember they tend to move around a fair bit because they're in America and then they're in like Paris and then they're in Buckingham Palace and then they're back to the, I can't think of your American things. The faces in the wall, Mount Rushmore. That's the one.
Oh, yeah, Mount
Yeah, you
Rushmore.
know.
And they were also in Virginia. I think they do a lot of stuff in DC in this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they probably move around a similar amount as the first one, but it feels like they're globetrotting at a higher pace than the first one. I think it felt like they had a bit more budget. It's like, well, let's go, like, fuck it, let's go to France. Let's see what happens. So it's fine. And obviously, you know, with the villain of this one, I think it's good that it sort of links to the Gates past a bit more because I think it was Ed Harris. I think it was who was the villain in this one, and then it's just like decades old rivalry and about him framing the Gates family for being behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, I think it was. So there's more like stakes in some senses as well, and Ben's dad is back. We get to meet like his mother as well, so we get more like backstory on this, which is good. There's like more stakes, and obviously his mother Emily Appleton Gates, played by Helen Mirren, is in this, so the cast is slightly bigger, the stakes are slightly higher. So it's a perfectly good sequel. Like I say, it carries on the momentum of the first film and what was established there as well. And then they just didn't do a third one, which we're all still 15 years later, still very, very sad about.
Yeah, because they did it was still very formulaic. If you take a step back and look, like the first one was about Ben Gates trying to, restore his family's legacy, or I guess to build it up at that point, because they're all looked down at as like crazy people that believed in this treasure that didn't exist. And so it's about redeeming his family name, and they carry over that theme. I think it was interesting. Ed Harris, his antagonist, Mitch Wilkinson, I think he's a bit more complicated than Sean Bean's character in the first one. His motivations are like he doesn't necessarily want the treasure. He wants his name in history as the one who found the treasure, and he's like, it was not a plot to like he didn't fake that the Gates family was involved in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. That's just what he was led to believe based on the facts that were presented to him, the story that was passed down to him through his family, and the evidence that he had, which was this burnt piece from I think John Wilkes Booth's diary that had Thomas Gates' name on it. So I think a little bit more of a complicated antagonist, which I appreciated. It wasn't quite so good guy, bad guy, though. I mean, he's still in the same way that Sean Bean's character was like willing to, threaten to kill people. Like he was doing that as well. But the motivation wasn't quite as like, I'm just a greedy guy and I'm going to throw everyone under the bus. to get what I want necessarily. I appreciate that. Ed Harris is a good actor, and I think he did a good job in that role. So that was one of the things that stood out to me comparing the two.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you say, Sean Bean's role in the first one's quite black and white. It's quite just easily definable. You don't need to do that much more with it because it works for the film. And obviously, as we're saying here, Ed Harris's character, much more of a complex villain, and obviously going on sort of, I think a lot of this film is like the power of history, the power of stories and such as well. But when I was sort of looking into this, just as like found some information which kind of appeals to me about the potential of this Cage multiverse and Cage films being potentially connected here. So when going back to 1996's The Rock, there's a guy who gets his Hummer stolen by Sean Connery, and in this movie, Ed Harris steals someone's car. They're both played by the same person, which means, in no uncertain terms to me, that the Rock and National Treasure movies exist in the same universe. And also in The Rock, Cage's character Stanley Goodspeed has access to the JFK files, which basically who actually killed JFK, as does Cage's character here. So in 2 movies, Nicolas Cage has found out who killed John F. Kennedy. So these movies, this universe is connected. I've got the cork board behind me with all the red string connecting to the newspaper clippings and like 8x10 Polaroids. It all adds up. It's all there, people. Do your own research. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I would love to go down that rabbit hole sometime. The other thing with this is, I mean, you touched on the cast with Jon Voight returning, Helen Mirren being added as the mother character, which was unnecessary, but I think certainly welcome. I think it adds a nice dynamic, another like emotional point as well, because there was a point where it looked as though Ben Gibbs is going to be sacrificing himself so that his parents, were he and Abigail married at this point? I don't even remember. And I just watched this last night.
Yeah, I think between the first and the second film, they got married and divorced.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what
and
I thought.
And then Treasure Fate sort of brings them back together, as Treasure Fate is known to do, of course.
Yeah, and Riley's there also, still doing the same Riley thing, the helpful sidekick / comic relief. Justin Bartha, I think, plays that role really well. One nitpick I had with this sort of parallel relationship storyline between Ben and Abigail and Ben's parents, in that they were separated and then they come back through this series of events and then, rekindle their love for each other. It just seems a little too fairy tale, but I suppose this is a Disney movie as well, so we can cut them some slack there.
Yeah, nothing saves a relationship like threatening both of your lives in a dungeon. Tell that to all my ex-wives.
Trauma bonding. It's the key to a long-lasting relationship.
I mean, if you look at the subtext of the National Treasure films, it is trauma that is really the hero of the pieces. I think in many ways, Riley's the only sort of person who comes out intact. Obviously, he gets that. There's like the Ferrari at the end of the first film when he's sort of effectively a struggling author in this one, because I think everyone keeps mistaking him for Ben until someone finally gets to sign a copy of his book at the end. So, I think Riley is the real hero of the piece.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because the subtitle, Book of Secrets, I really don't know that this was the natural subtitle, because it's alluding to the United States president's Book of Secrets, which is supposedly, I don't know if this is actually a real thing or not that people believe, but at least within the movie, it's this idea that all American presidents have passed along this book of all of America's secrets over history. And it's a great idea to build a movie around, but I don't think they actually built the movie around that idea. It's just like one plot point in the second act, and it gets called back to later on. Really, they probably should have called this one National Treasure 2, I'm going to kidnap the president,
Well, it's a National Treasure 2. We needed bigger stakes than the first movie. So I suppose it's, once you've as a duo stolen the Declaration of Independence, how do you top that? Because you think about they steal the Declaration of Independence within like the first 30, 40 minutes of the first film. So, and that's not even like the main thing about the film. That's just a plot point of something they have to do. Whereas John Voight's character will keep saying, "You just get to another clue, and then another clue, and then another clue," which is about 3/4 of his dialogue in the first film. So then you've got to kidnap the president, and then obviously it's a bit of like a MacGuffin, like, oh, this is the thing that has all the secrets. And then if you look to, I think it was page 47. I think that was the page that had the actual reveal of what had happened to Lincoln, if I remember correctly. But then you never actually find out what's on page 47. So that's obviously been a big topic of discussion for the past 15 years as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the stakes and the way that they've, they elevated it from the Declaration of Independence to the president. And I mean, it seems only natural that when we do get a third film, Ben Gates is going to have to steal the presidential election. It's going to be very, very topical.
Well,
it's just the only way they can move at this point, really.
Well, naturally, John Voight is going to be wearing a MAGA hat, and then Nicolas Cage is going to be, he's going to have to steal, I don't know, Bernie Sanders or something at this point for the grassroots treasure hunters out there. Because it's sort of frustrating that you don't find out what's on page 47. There was a press day for the screening, and someone asked John Turteltaub what was on page 47, and he said it was the plot of Star Trek. But there's speculation that it might relate to, I think I had down there, 18.5 minutes of conversations recorded from the Watergate tapes. It could be a mystery about George Washington at Mount Vernon. It could be about other secret societies. So, it's just spin the wheel of American mythology and, tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theories and just throw a dart on it. And that's probably what's on page 47.
Yeah, it seems like it's, just this mysterious MacGuffin. It was never really written out. Like you said, it sounds like it's just whatever you want it to be kind of thing. And I don't know. I don't mind it that they didn't answer it. If they, in the series they reference it, or if we get a third film and they come out and talk about it or address it directly, I would love it. But do I need that? Probably not.
No, I mean, it just makes me think that there'll just be like the end of an episode in the TV series. So like, so on page 47 was, and then it cuts to credits. I will bet all of my treasure hunted doubloons on it.
Yeah. And so to kind of summarize this one again for anyone, it's been a couple of years since you've watched it, or if you have no interest in really watching it but want to hear the general take of what it is. It's basically the first movie, as we've said, except for Ben's ancestor has now been accused of being involved in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Really what was happening is that he was being used for his code deciphering skills by that group to try and hunt down this second large treasure of American history. And essentially, they now go down this rabbit hole where they are finding this treasure that is an Olmec treasure, I believe. That was, I don't know where it was actually at. Was it in, I know Mount Rushmore was built as a cover-up. That was one of the fun lines in this. Mount Rushmore was a cover-up to try and hide the treasure. But I don't know if it was actually in those mountains. Yes, it is. Again, the IMDb page is clutch, because as I was saying that, it just flashed the entrance to this cavern where the treasure was, right behind the faces on Mount Rushmore.
The mysterious American city of gold, because where else would it be than in front of Mount Rushmore? Gold Rushmore.
Notably,
right?
It's not El Dorado. It's not, because that would be in some place other than the United States. That would be in South America. But it has to be this American treasure.
It's called the Dorado for all you history nerds out there.
So yeah, I think it was very formulaic. It did try to one up itself in some ways, but you get all of the main cast returning. You get some other interesting faces. We already mentioned Helen Mirren. Bruce Greenwood plays the president in this. Ty Burrell has a really small role, I think, as like a CIA or Secret Service guy from Modern Family. But it's another one where you'll recognize some faces, and I think well done. I think it deserves to be in the same conversation as the first one, but admittedly, it wasn't quite as fresh, and so that's the only thing really that probably knocks it a couple points in my book.
Yeah, I would very much agree. Like I say, it's more of the same, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And obviously, they tried to add some depth to sort of the Gates family, which is absolutely fine. Largely, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it thing. I think one of the few things I take exception with, I think for both movies, is that, and I always say this on my podcast, this is if you take these kind of things into consideration, because ultimately, if you enjoy a movie, that's the most important thing. But Rotten Tomatoes, last time I checked, now it could have changed since, but last time I had it, they had the first National Treasure at 46% and National Treasure 2 at 36%. I think they deserve a little bit more than that. I think the judge, are they silly plots? Yes, but they're fun and they're, you can just forget yourself for a few hours. And then with the Razzies as well, this is kind of a point of contention I'd had on my podcast. For about 10 straight years, they've been trying to hit Nicolas Cage with a Worst Actor nomination for like a consecutive period of 2007 to 2017. He was nominated by them in some form. This was no exception. He got a 2008 Worst Actor, collectively judged on this, National Treasure 2, Ghost Rider, and Next. He did lose out to Eddie Murphy for his role in Norbit, but I think... they had, for lack of a better term, something of a hard-on for him for a while. He never won it. I think he's probably the most nominated Razzie actor that's never won it, which I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. But they've mostly just been hating on Sylvester Stallone and Eddie Murphy for a long time. And thankfully, in more recent years, Nicolas Cage has sort of been out of their crosshairs. They've let him go. But, whenever I think of this film, I just think that in those 2000s, there was a target on his back. And I wish there was more that I could have done.
Yeah, I mean, they just need to leave the man alone. Those three films, I think this is by far his best performance compared to the other two. I mean, Ghost Rider, I feel like was up and down throughout the own film, and the Next was just ridiculous. So I don't know. You've done obviously 100 episodes on this, so I'll yield to your knowledge and expertise on all things Cage performances. But the reason we're even talking about this is because not only do we have the National Treasure Edge of History series coming to Disney Plus, I believe at the same time that this episode is releasing, they're going to drop the first 2 episodes of that show. And then in August of this year, we had producer Jerry Bruckheimer, who was being interviewed after the release of Top Gun Maverick, actually confirmed that there is a script written for National Treasure 3. And I believe that Nick Cage kind of teased a potential return to the role as well recently too. So it seems like this is probably going to be happening.
Well, maybe, hopefully. I mean, I will say as well that, I sort of take a step back on a National Treasure 3 because it's been heavily rumoured for as long as we haven't had a National Treasure 3. For about 15 years, it's been some form of development hell or rumoured, or there's been about a script for about as long as well, 15 years, but it just never happened. Cage has always said that he's wanting to do National Treasure 3. I think he quite likes doing these kind of adventurous sort of family-friendly films. But obviously we're getting the National Treasure TV series, Edge of History, obviously focusing on a younger cast. Now, allegedly, Nicolas Cage will be reprising his role in a greenlit second season. Apparently they tried to get him for the first season, but they couldn't. But obviously they had Justin Bartha coming back as Riley Paul, Harvey Keitel back as Peter Sadusky. So if you get those sort of characters, I think it's only a matter of time that Cage was going to come along as well. And he has been dipping his toe into more TV recently. He doesn't do a lot of TV, but we're seeing more of the TV side of Cage these days as well. So I feel like he's going to show up in the TV series first. It'll probably lead to National Treasure 3. Then we're going to get the National Treasure cinematic universe and then more spin-offs. But I think what they've been missing for the last 20 years, make a National Treasure escape room. You cowards, it's right there for the taking.
Oh yes, absolutely. That is a brilliant idea. I love that.
It's money. It's money to be made, and Disney, I will accept my check whenever you're ready to give it to me.
That is easy money. It should be at every Disney park and across the country. Let's just open it up to everyone. It's everyone's treasure. Nicolas Cage is everyone's treasure.
Well, this is it, and the fact that at the Disney parks in Orlando, there isn't an actor dressed as Nicolas Cage, Ben Gates, with his sort of backwards Nicolas Cage hair, walking round with a Declaration of Independence, is a travesty. Is one of the biggest travesties of Disney's history.
Yeah, no, I think that was such a natural fit. I really do love that idea. But no, you hit on it. So Justin Bartha is returning. He's credited for all 10 episodes of the first season here, so it looks like he plays an important role in the series. And I actually didn't know about Nicolas Cage's involvement in a second season, but that would be I'd take that in a heartbeat, and would love to see a third film. But if that's all we get of Ben Gates' involvement in a second season of this show, beggars can't be choosers. So I'd be happy with that for sure.
Definitely. I mean, I think they're trying to keep very quiet about Nicolas Cage's involvement, certainly in the first season. I don't think if he shows up at all, I think it won't be till the very last episode of the first season. That's what my Cage radar sense is telling me. So I think obviously, everyone this day and age associates National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. It's a franchise he's very well known for. And obviously when it was announced, the first question people were asking was, is Nicolas Cage going to be in the TV show? Does this mean National Treasure 3? I think there was a Comic-Con panel where I think someone had said they tried to reach him, but he wouldn't do it. And then before that, Nicolas Cage just said that he'd never been contacted. So there was a little inconsistency in whether or not we would get some Cage. But I have a feeling that if he's going to show up at all season 1, it's going to be some kind of cliffhanger thing at the end of episode like 10 or whatever it is.
Yeah, he essentially is just Luke Skywalker in The Force Awakens. He's just going to be referenced repeatedly, and then at the very end, the last scene of this first season, someone's just going to walk up to him. They're gonna hand him the Declaration of Independence, and he's going to toss it off a bridge, and we're going to roll credits.
He's gonna stand atop the Statue of Liberty and watch as America burns. That's going to be the final image of the National Treasure series. Mark my words.
And I think that would be lovely. Any involvement from Nicolas Cage in this is going to be just so welcome. So I'm really hoping we end up seeing it. Daryl, thank you again for joining me for this episode. This was so much fun. I think I had no doubts, but now it's all been confirmed 1000%. You were the perfect person to bring on to talk about these wonderful works of Nicolas Cage and sort of the future of this historical series. And where I know you're caught up on Cage now for the podcast, but what else have you been working on? Is there anything that we can plug for you while we got you?
Well, thank you again for inviting me. Very, very happy to be here. Had a lot of fun discussing Cage. Always a pleasure, never a chore. You can certainly find me on pretty much the majority of the socials, mostly active on Twitter. That's if it hasn't exploded by the time this episode comes out. You can find me at Cage_podcast, and for the Nicolas Cage podcast, CageRage. I'm on all the usual streaming platforms, Instagram, I'm on TikTok, I've got a Tumblr now, which I probably won't use, but it's there. The link trees are on all the usual socials. And in the future is being worked on slowly in the background, but myself and a fellow Nicolas Cage podcast, Caged In, will be joining forces to work on a little series we're calling Getting Dafoe You, which is a series which we are going to look at the entire works of one of Hollywood's other notorious madmen, Willem Dafoe, from Heaven's Gate to the present day. So join us over there at Getting Dafoe You, at Dafoe You Pod, and it is going to be a very maddening time because we refuse to look at sane people.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you are looking for a very specific, guest voice for an episode that their knowledge is limited to exclusively Green Goblin, you let me know, and I'll make time for it.
That is what I'm all about. That's the energy I'm bringing to the world, and literally nothing else.
Well, thank you again, Daryl. For the listeners, check out the description. We'll have links to everything that Daryl mentioned there ready for you to click through. Highly recommend checking that stuff out, and definitely consider going on the 100-episode journey to get fully caught up on all things Nicolas Cage.
Thanks again so much.
So that was our conversation about Nicolas Cage and the National Treasure franchise. This is a franchise that is so much fun, and I'm very excited to see it getting a little bit of love from Disney in this new era of Disney with Disney Plus, and Disney just having a much more active role on television through streaming. And I'm very curious to see what directions they take this series. The fact that it's a whole brand new batch of characters, it could go either way for me. I'm hoping that it is just super fresh and revitalizes some of the themes and elements of the movies that we've loved but have maybe grown a bit stale or outdated. That's sort of the best case scenario, and that's what I'm hoping for. It's great to see that some actors were reprising their roles as characters from those films. Most notably, as we talked about, Justin Bartha as Riley Poole, and hopefully, if the rumors are true, that there is a little bit of Nicolas Cage flavor at the end of this season and going into a potential second season as well. And of course, we always want there to be a third full-on National Treasure film. I want to thank Daryl again for joining me for this episode. Just fantastic. The absolute authority on Nicolas Cage at this point. Go check out the CageRage podcast. 100 wonderful episodes about the just national treasure himself, Nicolas Cage. I promise you will not be disappointed. Check out the links in the description of this episode to see that through. In 2 weeks, I am hoping we're going to be talking about murder mystery movies. I'm going to try and tie that into New Year's Eve, perhaps, because that one's going to be dropping on December 29th, 2 weeks from the release of this episode. So stay tuned. Make sure you are subscribed so that you can catch that episode and more. If you have a moment, I would ask that you please like or comment on this video on YouTube, or you please rate and review this podcast on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. It means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it as a small podcast that is hoping to, continue to do better one step at a time. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll stick around for more.